In June of 2023, Michael and I were on a road trip south of Daytona, Florida, in search of concrete dinosaurs in an abandoned amusement park formerly known as Bongoland. We came to search for dinosaurs, but we ended up having about a 2-hour stroll through this beautifully tended and manicured park that doubled as an interesting but also sobering history lesson. The setting is known as the Dunlawton Sugar Mill Gardens, and its history began long before Florida even initially became a state of the Union in 1845. Originally, Florida was divided up and sold as large tracts of land grants from Spain. In 1804, a 995-acre tract of land was awarded to a merchant from the Bahamas named Patrick Dean. He grew sugarcane, cotton, rice, and possibly also indigo. He was reportedly violently killed by a Native American Indian or perhaps an enslaved person in 1818. The plantation eventually passed as an inheritance to Dean's uncle John Bunch, a planter from Nassau who became an officer in the British Navy. The land then passed down to Bunch's grandson, John B. Bunch McCarty. He had no interest in farming, so he sold the land to property brokers named Charles and Joseph Lawton for $3,000. A woman named Sarah Petty Dunn Anderson inherited a 450-acre plantation a little further to the north. After her husband died, she and her sons sold that property and used the proceeds to buy the Dean plantation. They filed under a fictitious name for the purchase, combining her maiden name Dunn with the name Lawton to create the name Dunlawton Plantation. The property was purchased for $4,500 in 1832, and they went on to produce sugar and molasses until December of 1835. By late November of 1835, white settlers in the territory of Florida were becoming more and more alarmed by the activities of the Seminole Indians, whose leaders vehemently protested the United States' new official policy of removal of Native American Indians. A killing by Osceola himself threatened to provoke an armed confrontation. On December 17, 1835, Joseph Hernandez ordered troops to protect the plantations in the vicinity of the Matanzas, Took, and Mosquito rivers. Major Benjamin A. Putnam, a lawyer from St. Augustine, led a detachment of the local militia to Dunlawton Plantation, where the Anderson family were attempting to place the estate in a condition prepared for defense by erecting a stockade. Sarah Anderson's sons were impressed into service with the detachment. On Christmas Eve, 1835, the Seminole Indians began their attacks and plunderings against the plantations south of St. Augustine. Over the next several weeks, the marauding Indians burned or ransacked 16 plantations, including the Kruger de Peister and Dunlawton estates. Many of the refugees fled their destroyed plantations and gathered at the Charles Wilhelm Bulow estate. Upon his return from the south, General Hernandez ordered an occupation of Bulowville. The Mosquito Roarers, under their captain Douglas Dummett and a company of poorly trained militia, were dispatched to the Dunlawton plantation to recover abandoned supplies. On January 17, 1836, troops were headed southward toward Dunlawton. As they approached, they saw that a large crowd of war party Seminoles still occupied the land. The Andersons' dwelling house and several slave houses were burning when the command arrived, although the plantation was only partly destroyed. Heavy fire was exchanged in the skirmish, but the militiamen were unable to drive the Indians away. By early February, the Seminoles had succeeded in forcing the white settlers to abandon most of the territory south of St. Augustine. The Anderson family did not receive money after the war to help with rebuilding expenses, so the plantation sat abandoned. In September of 1846, a man named John Marshall purchased the mill for $8,000. He rebuilt the plantation and installed processing machinery bought from the destroyed Kruger de Peyster mill in New Smyrna. With the labor of 25 slaves, he began sugar production again from 1849 until 1853. Management was a constant problem during the years Marshall operated the mill, and the plantation failed to run effectively. The eventual collapse of the sugar market caused him to quit the enterprise and sell the property. The plantation changed hands several times in the following years and was used for a variety of purposes. Eventually, it returned to the Marshall family. In 1856, the property was burned down and totally destroyed again during the Third Seminole Indian War. In 1862, the property became a camp headquarters for the St. John Rangers during the American Civil War. They hitched their horses under a large live oak that is now known as the Confederate oak. Throughout the war, the cane juice kettles were used for the production of salt for food preservation and also to make ammunition. The John Marshall property was sold to a man named William Doherty in 1871, and William's son Charles inherited the property on his father's death. Charles was a successful lawyer and eventually was elected Florida's first United States congressman. Charles had no interest in agriculture, and the mill was never operated to produce sugar again. Between 1871 and 1904, it was sold off slowly in smaller and smaller lots. The Dunlawton Plantation went on to have several lives after it ceased sugar production. As seems to be common with many abandoned structures from the 19th century Florida, it was mistakenly identified as the ruins of an old Spanish mission dating back to the 1960s, and it was attracting tourists as early as 1939. In 1906, the furnaces were fired up again when 2 whales beached themselves under the newly built Port Orange Bridge, and their blubber was boiled down to create oil in the sugar kettles. For 4 years in the 1940s to 50s, a children's amusement park called Bongo Land sat on the property, complete with a train ride, reconstructed and reenacted Seminole Indian village, a zoo with a resident monkey, and statues of dinosaurs created out of chicken wire and concrete. I have done a completely separate video on the history of Bongo Land. Unfortunately, that park was short-lived, and the property sat neglected again until the 1980s, when it was bequeathed to Volusia County, and it began to turn into the beautiful botanical gardens that it is today, all thanks to a wonderful group of volunteers and gardeners who care.